All right, so now we're going to talk about gender-based violence. And as it says in the module for this chapter, this is something that may be difficult for anyone to talk about, much less those who may have experienced some of this themselves. So just be aware that this is difficult for everyone. I ask that you be extra sensitive in the discussions this week, just because you don't know anyone's lived experience, nor do they owe you any sort of disclosure of that. So, and also because there's so many important concepts, this is going to be a little bit longer. I have experience in this area, so while I was in graduate school, worked with a lot of people with eating disorders who unfortunately tend to have experienced some of this sometimes, and that relates to how they feel about their bodies. I also worked for the year at the VA, working with mostly survivors of military sexual trauma, which we'll get into what that is. So I'm very sensitive to this and know a lot about it. And so I think it's important to spend a little more time than maybe some of the other chapters, making sure we're all on the same page about the concepts, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there around this topic. So gender-based violence is a form of violence that's motivated by anger, hatred, or bias because of a person's gender. And so this is not only because they're a woman versus a man, but it can be people who are non-binary, people who are trans, for example. So we're going to talk a lot about women, but know that these other issues are really important as well. So here are some statistics here. So almost a quarter of women have experienced severe physical violence. So women are often murdered by men, most commonly with a gun. Transgender women are murdered, unfortunately, at quite a high rate, particularly transgender women of color. It's really disturbing how many of them are killed. And violence against women has increased since 2008, where crimes against men have dropped. So there could be partially more reporting here, but it could also be a backlash against some of the advances women have made. So in terms of what could happen to our youth, you can have physical, psychological, and child sexual abuse, and these are not mutually exclusive, and often, unfortunately, they go hand in hand. So physical abuse is acts of physical force that are intended to cause physical pain. Spanking is really common as sort of a form of corporal punishment, but psychological research showed there's actually a lot of negative effects of this. So psychologists don't even recommend spanking, much less anything above that. Psychological abuse is behaviors intended to cause fear, shame, isolation, and/or deprivation. So this includes verbal abuse, which is speech that's denigrating or humiliating, and emotional abuse, which is behavior that aims to control or manipulate the individual. And then childhood sexual abuse is any sexual activity between an adult and a minor. And this is wrong for so many reasons. The child can't give consent. They're not developmentally there. And this happens to kids so young they don't even know what sex is or what's happening. Abuser of girls tend to be family members or someone close to the family. And I certainly don't want to exclude the narrative of boys who are abused. Certainly we have, unfortunately, strong examples in our minds. For example, the Penn State case or the case in the Catholic Church. But girls are actually abused at a much higher rate. We just tend not to hear about it. So high rates of mental and physical health problems are associated with any type of gender-based violence. Resiliency is one of the concepts people have studied, and this is the capacity to successfully adapt to trauma or stress. So this is a belief in personal strength, plus social support and connecting to one's cultural community may provide relief from the negative effects of childhood abuse. However, if we focus too much on this, it puts an undue burden on survivors. Like, why can't you just be resilient? Because this was a horrible, horrible thing that happened to them. So you may have heard this term sort of bandied around, the idea of rape culture. So rape cultures occur when sexual violence is normalized and perpetrators don't fear repercussions. And you have a great Blackboard reading for this module about a sociologist who studied this in different tribal cultures. And there are cultures where rape essentially doesn't exist. So this whole idea that it's like innate and you just have to do it. No, not true. So there's a distinction in terms here that, again, I think a lot of people aren't clear about. So sexual assault is a general term, sort of an umbrella term that refers to different types of sexual abuse. So this can include rape, but also attempted rape, unwanted sexual touching, and or sexual harassment. So a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people who are talking in the #MeToo movement are talking about sexual assault. And this is experienced by more than 1/3 of women. And then rape is penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. And 1 in 5 women in the US will be raped in her lifetime, typically before the age of 25, although it can certainly happen after. And I believe it's 1 in 4 college women. So rape myths are a false belief about how and why rape occurs, and they typically are wrapped up in what's called victim blaming. This is a type of blame that shifts responsibility away from the perpetrator, the person who's actually doing the raping and actually at fault for raping, right? And onto the survivor of the assault. So you have an inaccurate depiction of reality from these rape myths and victim blaming, and that plays into the rape culture. That plays into doubt and self-blame among survivors, and that's going to give you less accountability for perpetrators because it's less likely that survivors will report, much less press charges, much less go through the very onerous court system. So I'm going to go over some myths and realities here that I think are really important to go over because these are really common misconceptions that people truly believe, and they can be really harmful. And also they all skirt the things we need to actually fix if you start focusing on these myths. So the myth is that women lie about being raped, but in the reality, women rarely lie about rape. It's extremely underreported. As you can see here, only about 0.5% to 7% of reported rapes are unsubstantiated or false. And that's the same percentage as any other crime. So let that sink in of this idea, oh, women are making it up. Same percentage as any other crime. And other important facts here. I mean, half of women don't even realize they have been raped because they have one narrative about being raped that doesn't fit with what actually happened to them. And as I mentioned before, they're less likely to report because they're very afraid of not being believed. So myth is that rape is usually committed by a stranger danger, right? But in reality, rape is mostly committed by intimate partners or acquaintances, someone you know. So they give you some percentages here, and something that we need to look at are these scripts we have about rape. So in the traditional rape script, it's committed by a stranger, someone jumps out of the bushes with a knife or corners you in a bathroom, and that's used to justify discrimination against trans bathroom rights. So I'm filming this in summer 2020, and the whole issue with J.K. Rowling not being trans affirming has just come out, and she is using this argument. When in fact, it's actually much, much more likely that someone who's trans will be attacked themselves in a bathroom. There's also really scary stuff related to the Black Lives Matter movement that's also going on, a lot of important issues in summer of 2020 here. So the myth of the Black rapist has been used to justify violence against Black boys and men. The classic case of this is Emmett Till. If you've seen the movie Black Klansman, this case is described in that. But essentially he was a boy that a white woman said he winked at her, and because of that, he was put on trial, and then without going through formal sentencing, pulled out of the courtyard and literally torn apart by a crowd. Horrifying. And then a recent example, again in 2020, is Christian Cooper. So this was the birdwatcher walking through Central Park who asks the woman to have her dog on a leash in a part of Central Park where it's required. And she started hysterically calling the police, claiming there was a Black man threatening her life when he had just asked her to put her dog on a leash. She weaponized this idea against that man. So a myth is that survivors actively fight off their attacker, but in reality, many women who are raped are not able to fight back. They might know their attacker, they might be intoxicated. Sometimes they are purposely intoxicated with something like their date rape drug or punches that have Benadryl put in them, things like that at parties. They might want to reduce the risk of injury. They're just trying to protect themselves. And there's also a fear response that we don't talk about that much. That's known as tonic immobility. And when we talk about fight or flight, this is also called the freeze response. And so this is an involuntary frozen body response that occurs in high fear situations, essentially to protect you. So this is the deer in the headlights, the possum playing dead, things along those lines. So this happens in the animal world. It can happen to us as well. So self-defense programs can help, but a lot of feminists argue that they're also very much putting the onus on the victim or potential victim rather than actually addressing the fact that we should teach perpetrators not to do this. Myth is that sex with someone who's incapacitated or drunk is not rape. If the person can't give consent, then it's rape. So incapacitated rape is when someone rapes a person who's intoxicated, unconscious, or asleep. So they feel blame, the people that this happens to, and college students unfortunately experience this at a higher rate than other portions of the population. Another myth is that girls and women are partially responsible for being raped based on their clothing and behavior. Oh, she was asking for it because she was wearing that. There's a great YouTube video related to this in your extra documentation for this module. In reality, the only one responsible for the rape is the rapist. So I had a supervisor when I worked at the VA, and she said, you could walk down the street completely naked. Now, the police could maybe arrest you for public indecency, but no one has the right to touch you. No one has the right to rape you. So it doesn't matter what you were wearing. There have been great art exhibits about this where they've asked survivors to give them the clothing they were wearing. And it's like PJ pants and a hoodie, right? It's not, it doesn't matter what you were wearing. It can happen to anyone, and it's still on the rapist. It's not on the survivor. Another myth is that sexual force is a normal aspect of male sexuality. I've already referred to this. In reality, there's no evidence that this is a normal aspect of male sexuality. And in my opinion, this is an insult to men, right? The idea that you can't control yourself, and so you have to rape people. How insulting is that to guys? Sex and rape are distinct things. Rape is about power and control. It's about degrading and harming others. It's not about sex. Another myth is that rape only happens to heterosexual women, but rape can happen to anyone. It can happen to men, either by women or most often by other men. It can happen to sexual minority women and men, so non-binary individuals, people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and it can happen to trans people. And in fact, their rates are very high, unfortunately. And sometimes what you see related to this is what people call corrective rape, where someone will try to rape someone into being straight or not trans. Clearly doesn't work, but there's this belief that it does. Myth is that consent is clear-cut and can be readily understood, but it's not as simple as it may seem. Men are more likely to give and rely on nonverbal consent than women. Compliant sex is sex that occurs when a person agrees to sexual acts that are unwanted, maybe because they feel pressure into it. Sometimes they're coerced into consenting, manipulated by the person, threats from the person. And then there's this idea about token resistance. Men have this belief that women say no, but they really mean yes, when in fact, women don't use that as much as they think. So what we want to work towards is affirmative consent. So affirmative consent is mutual, explicit, voluntary, active consent that is given before a sexual act and then checked in on throughout the process. So we agreed to make out. We still need to check to make sure it's good to go on to the next space. Yes means yes. So this is a model for understanding rape and consent, or looking at different models, really. So the dominant model right now is one of the top two. So either sex is either wanted and consensual or unwanted and non-consensual. So the only possible way you can be raped is if it's non-consensual and unwanted. The dominant model is rape is unwanted non-consensual sex. Same thing. But the new model is that wanting and consenting are distinct concepts, and that non-consensual sex is rape. So whether you wanted it initially or didn't want it initially, if you didn't consent, it's rape, period. So who endorses these rape myths we just went over? So we see these more among men, although there certainly are women who buy into them too. People who are higher on sexual aggression, higher on hostile attitudes towards women, people who engage in problematic drinking behaviors, women who have experienced objectification, people with authoritarian personality traits, people who watch more TV, and people who have other forms of intolerance, so sexism, racism, homophobia, ageism, classism, religious intolerance, etc. And one of the problems that plays into this is something called the just world hypothesis, or belief in a just world. So this is the belief that people get what they deserve, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. So if you were raped, then you must have done something wrong, because that could only happen to a bad person. Now, you and I know that's not true, and unfortunately anyone can be sexually assaulted. But if you believe these rape myths, that like the woman brought it on herself because of what she was wearing, then you can protect yourself by saying, well, I wouldn't dress that way, so this would never happen to me. A really important thing to talk about here is sexual assault in the military. So as I mentioned, I worked previously with survivors of what's called military sexual trauma. And this is women who are sexually assaulted by people on their same side. So often superiors or fellow military men. This can also happen to men in the military, and sometimes they have a harder time with it because often it is a heterosexual man who's raped by another man. And so then he starts questioning, why did this happen to me? Should I question my sexuality? And of course he shouldn't. But up to 30%, so almost a third of enlisted women report experienced sexual assault during their military service. Now, this would be like on an anonymous survey. Very few of these are actually reported anymore. And so this is often called the invisible war, where a woman who enlists is more likely to be raped by a fellow soldier than be killed by enemy fire. And there's a trailer for a film called The Invisible War that was created about this as part of your extra materials for this module. It's a difficult but important watch if you want to see the whole thing. I know at one point it was on Netflix. Then there's what's called cultural spillover theory, which is the idea that widespread cultural support for violence leads to increased acceptability of violence in other aspects of life. Stranger harassment or street harassment is harassment of typically women in public places by men who are strangers. So catcalling, leers, winks, pinches, remarks. Sometimes these men will follow the women. Very terrifying. In a study of undergraduate women, somewhere between 57 and 88% reported experiencing verbal street harassment. So this is very common. It can make women feel very unsafe. And just something you have to deal with sometimes every day if you work in a major city. Okay, so we've been talking about sexual assault, sexual harassment. We talked more about sexual harassment last module when we talked about work. Now we're going to talk about interpersonal violence. So domestic violence is any abusive, violent, coercive, forceful, or threatening act by one member of the family or household toward another. So anyone within the family. Intimate partner violence is a form of domestic violence involving violence by one member of an intimate couple against the other. Now, before the 1970s, there was almost no public recognition that this was even a thing. It was just sort of assumed that what happened behind closed doors is something we shouldn't worry about. So in terms of types of intimate violence, so there's common couples violence, which is sometimes called situational couples violence, and this is the most frequent form of interpersonal violence or intimate partner violence. So it occurs when conflict spontaneously escalates to violence and isn't severe typically. And this tends to be pretty gender symmetrical. So men do it to women do it to men, etc. Intimate terrorism is coercive controlling violence. This is the most frequently discussed form of IPV, and the violence occurs more regularly and it increases in severity over time, and men commit this more often. And then there's violent resistance, which is sometimes labeled as self-defense, and this occurs in response to violence from a partner. So for example, it may even be that the woman kills her partner in order to be able to escape this abusive relationship, and women commit this more than men. This is the wheel of power and control. This is often talked about in women's and gender studies classes, talking about how these things happen. So it's reinforced by social beliefs, which give one partner the right to dominate the other. And so you can see all of the different things that can come in here, like economic abuse, not allowing the other partner to work so they're financially reliant on you. There's physical violence, there's cyber abuse, degradation, using the children, so threatening to harm your children or sometimes even your pets if you try to leave or say anything. So intimate terrorism I wanted to go into more because it's so important to talk about. So abusive relationships are mixed with intense love and violence. And there's this cycle of abuse. And it consists of a tension building stage, a violent episode, and then there's this loving and contrition phase. Now, one of the things that's important to know is that not every relationship actually follows this pattern perfectly. But typically there is sort of this phase where the partner apologizes and acts really sweet, and that can sort of soothe the partner being abused into staying. Learned hopefulness is the belief that the abuser can change, so survivors will remain committed to the abusive relationship. And then coercive power is a type of power that leads survivor to think they will experience negative consequences if they don't comply with their abuser's demands. Again, threatening the children, threatening your pets. So these are some of the psychological tactics of abusers. So the princess effect is a tendency to make your partner feel uniquely special. And this is used by abusers to increase attachment and loyalty, often prior to the onset of violence. Gaslighting is really important. This is a term that's sort of like bandied around in our culture, but it actually has a meaning psychologically. It's a form of psychological abuse that involves manipulating victims into doubting their own memory, perception, or sanity. So the abuser responds to any conflict as if they themselves have been victimized. And this increases self-doubt, depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem. Then there's what's called battered woman syndrome, which talks about disruption in interpersonal relationships, body image distortion, and sexual intimacy issues. I'm not going to get too much into this, but just know that this topic is somewhat controversial. Some people had a problem with the original definitions and the original research behind it, but there is more modern research being done that does give it some support. This is often used as an explanation for why women will seemingly snap and kill their abusive partner. So why do people stay in abusive relationships? You might have seen this hashtag a few years back, hashtag why I stayed. Whole bunch of reasons. Fear of being attacked or killed by the abuser, and this is a legitimate fear. The most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when you try to leave. That's when you are most likely to be killed. Fear of your children getting kidnapped or being taken by child protective services. Financial dependence on the abuser. You don't have your own finances. Reliance on the abuser for health care. Housing instability and homelessness if you leave. Lack of social support. The abuser often cuts you off from all your friends and family. Stigma of divorce, of leaving your partner, of being the survivor of abuse. And lack of community resources for interpersonal violence survivors can be a problem, especially if you live in a smaller community. Now, something else that happens that people often are not aware about, unfortunately, is what's called sex trafficking. And this is commercial sex induced by force, fraud, or coercion. This is modern day slavery, where women and girls are kidnapped, sold into prostitution, but it's forced prostitution. And this is the second largest and fastest growing criminal industry in the world. And as you can see, a lot of children are sold into this. Girls and women in sex trafficking situations are often perceived to be criminals rather than the victims of a crime. They are the victims here. They can't control anything. Violence against older women and older men is something we need to consider as well. So elder abuse can be a single act or a repeated act occurring within the context of a trusting relationship that causes harm to a person over the age of 60. This often involves financial exploitation, neglect, and emotional abuse, but unfortunately sometimes it also involves physical abuse. And because we acknowledge that those in this age bracket sometimes are unable to care for themselves and reliant on others, this is actually one of the categories of at-risk individuals for which psychologists are mandated reporters. If a client came to us and said they have been abusing an elder or they know of an elder being abused, we have to report it. How can you heal after abuse? Well, one of the biggest things is one of the terms I've tried to use throughout this presentation, which is using the term survivor. So moving away from this idea that you are a victim to being a survivor, and that can be really empowering. So within the past couple of years, the Larry Nassar case was finally brought to light, where hundreds upon hundreds of American gymnasts were sexually abused by him under the guise of medical care. And they identify as a sisterhood of survivors, not victims. And that's very empowering to them. Restorative justice is another potential option. This focuses on rehabilitation through a process of facilitating meetings between the perpetrator and survivors, the goal of achieving reconciliation and commitment to peace. Especially in abusive relationships, this can disrupt the cycle of violence, but you have to approach this very carefully because the number one thing is you want to protect survivors. And also know that apologies are part of this cycle of abuse we've already talked about, so we can't always buy into what they tell us. This does reduce repeat offenses and harm to survivors, but again, how much harm is going to be put on the survivor by having to engage in this process? We need to take that into account. War is another thing that we need to acknowledge. So women and children account for 80% of war casualties and 80% of refugees. Rape has traditionally been used as a war tactic, and sometimes trying to forcibly impregnate people with their attacker so that they have to bear this mark of being conquered. So transnational feminists work against imperialism and militarism because girls and women bear the brunt of war more than others. So imperialism is a practice that extends a country's power through diplomacy or war or both. And then militarism is the prioritization and justification of military values within military and civilian life. So what can we do? So a lot of schools, Wesleyan included, have been offering educational programs that identify patterns of abuse and offer strategies for intervening. So in the past, Wesleyan has really engaged positively in what's called bystander intervention training. This is just teaching other people to step in when they witness a problematic situation. And sometimes it doesn't have to be a confrontation. It might just be you get the person who looks like they're in trouble out of that situation. Hey, do you want to come with me to get some water? Or, oh, you look like you might need to take a walk, something like that. All right, so again, thank you for bearing with me through this, I know, very difficult topic. And I will see you next week for the module with our last bit of new information.